This is part two of the chapter, Interpersonal Communication in Sport. The first part focused heavily on the parent role within sports. The vast majority of this second part is going to focus on the coach-athlete or coach-parent relationship. I think it's important to understand that while I'm teaching you guys from two lenses, from the lens of the textbook and then from the lens of my personal experiences as a coach or in some situations as a parent. So the first section is the last section that focuses on the parental influence, and it's referring to or referencing sex differences in sport. As our youth grow up, they become socialized typically into a sport, and typically females are more socialized into quote unquote feminine sports while males are socialized into quote unquote masculine sports. So some obvious things here are males are more likely to play something like hockey or football than females, and females are much more likely to play a sport like softball, soccer, swimming, things like that, gymnastics. What we should also recognize is that these socializations really become reflective of communication cultures. Within female sports, people speak differently than within male-dominated sports. Female sports tend to have more positive comments at female events. Male sports tend to have neutral to negative comments. Other things we know, and some of these things are probably evident or self-evident, that fathers typically lead parental pressures in sports. They are more likely to pressure their sons or daughters in sports. And remember, we talked about pressure specifically in the last section. So now we're talking about coaches. The chapter talks about the quote from Vince Lombardi: "Winning isn't everything. It's the only thing." And this kind of raises the question of really where our society is going. Or are we more of a competitive society, or are we more participation society? And we've all heard it, participation medals for doing things. Should we be rewarding people for just participating in things? Obviously, it's not an easy question. I think the age we're talking about really kind of comes into play. But are we just focused solely on winning as coaches or even as parents? And I think it depends. It depends on a lot of things. Hopefully, we're going to get into some of those things. At the end of the day, the coach's role can be kind of dwindled down into two overarching categories that have many subcategories. A coach's role is really to teach. Right? And this is to teach everything from the fundamentals of the sport to raise young men of character, as I like to say. It's not just about the fundamentals of the sport. The other role is be a game manager. You have to make assignments on who to put in a game, what plays to run, so on and so forth. At the end of the day, you also have to make decisions. What's best for the team versus what's best for an individual. You're going to make decisions on when you have to bench certain people in disciplinary roles, or you're going to have to make decisions when to play one player over another. And it is not easy. I can tell you guys, if you guys are going to end up being coaches or parents, parent coaches, whatever it is, or if you're just a parent watching and talking to other coaches, it is not easy, right? The story I like to give is, I was relatively new track and field coach. I might have had about 3 years under my belt. And there was one athlete who was having success in the current year. He was very young. He was only a sophomore in high school. But there was another athlete who was a senior who had done a lot for our team. He was not having the best of seasons, but he had like one decent race just prior to our state championship meet, or state qualifier meet, I should say. And I made a coach's decision to bench the young athlete who was having a really good year and play the senior who really was not having a great year. And I put him on a relay over the sophomore. And I made a decision on what I thought honestly was best for the team. This is an athlete who I felt like I could trust versus an athlete who I didn't. Um, long story short, it ended up working out, but what's best for the individual? I can tell you right now, this led to an interesting dynamic with this individual for the next few years. He was my best athlete for the next few years, but I think um, it created a issue in our relationship for years to come. He had some grounds to be upset. I get it, but I didn't really think about how it was going to affect him in the long run, and that affected our relationship for years to come. So, win at all costs, really. This is a lot of what the text talks about, and it brings ethics into question. There's certain examples which I think are very clear. Very clear. If you look at Bounty Gate from the New Orleans Saints, those of you that are not familiar with it, it was around 2011, 2012, when coaches for the New Orleans Saints were offering money to players who injured other players. Now, this is obviously, I think, in my opinion, an easy case of just something that's extreme and completely unethical. Um, but I think there's other examples that are not as clear cut. So do you bench a player because of bad grades? Some of you guys will say, yeah, you're a student athlete first. Okay, so here's my next question. You're going to face a lot of pressures as a coach to win, and it's going to force you to make very difficult decisions. Are you going to bench a player because of grades? What if he's, I don't know, the best or the second best player on the team and you have a championship game? And remember, this is a team sport. There's, I don't know if we're talking about football, how many players play football? 40, 50, 60, depending on the team. There's 50 other players that have been working incredibly hard to win that given championship. But now you're going to bench this one player because of their bad grades just for that one game. Or, I don't know, if they're late for practice, do you bench them because of that? Now you're forcing other people to suffer, right? Again, I think it's very context dependent. It's not an easy decision. Now we're looking at youth sports. Um, One aspect the text talks about was that athletes are developing at a higher rate than ever. Part of this is because of new technology, but another major part of this is because sports are now year-round. And this increased pressure, this puts an increased pressure on athletes to win. And the text does a good job highlighting, well, physically, yes, athletes are much more developed nowadays than ever before. Even at ages as like 11, 12, 13, 14, their skills are incredibly high. However, we have to remember that cognitively and emotionally, they may not be as gifted or developed as they might appear physically or skilled. So it's very important that as a coach, you start to recognize these things. Just because they are playing at an elite level, this could be a 10, 11, 12-year-old, you have to recognize you might not be able to treat them as an adult or an elite athlete. And interestingly enough, Coates et al. Found that Olympic athletes didn't even really need to be elite or treated like they were elite in terms of just putting pressure on them until at the very least age of 10. And some of you guys might say, oh, like that's still incredibly young. But I mean, that's the earliest. I think there's many athletes who at 14, 15, they still don't even find their sport. Not everyone is a gifted prodigy that took up the sport like Tiger Woods at 2 years old and was winning tournaments at 3 or 4, whatever he was winning at. Okay. The parent-coach relationships. The number one issue, is playing status for parents. So if their kids are not playing, odds are you're going to hear it from them. So there's two different categories here by two groups of researchers for parents. Kirk and McPhail put parents into one of four categories: non-attenders, spectators, helpers, and a committed member. So non-attenders are simply that. They just drop their kids off at practice and they don't even attend games or practices. Spectators, conversely, they do attend games, however, they don't really help. They really are there to just watch, and the communication to the parent is minimal at best. I can tell you guys personally, these are my favorite parents. I like to do what I can do, and I don't need parent kind of feedback on how to do my job. Then there's helpers, and helpers obviously attend games and practices, but they do other things. They do go above and beyond to help set up, clean up, so on and so forth. And then there is the committed member. And an example of the committed member might be someone like a team mom. A team mom is, someone who goes above and beyond. They help set up practices. They help make adjustments to schedules or create schedules. Even they help organize. Uh, uh, they help organize rides to and from games. All of those things. Now, Terman et al. Categorize parents into a different set of roles. One is just the spectator, very similar. Two is the enthusiast, and really the enthusiast is someone who speaks to coaches, and they try to use their knowledge, or at least their perceived knowledge, to sway a coach's decision one way or another. This could be like just telling a coach about like a potential defense they saw on TV or something along those lines. And then three is the fanatic. The fanatic is someone who knows no boundaries. And that's another key here. The Terman et al. Were specifically talking about boundaries for the parent and coach relationship. I did forget to mention that. The spectator, there are boundaries and they don't even talk. The enthusiast recognizes those boundaries and just tries to have kind of like small talk types of conversations. The fanatic knows no boundaries. They call a parent on the weekend, they text a parent at 11 p.m., they call them in the morning. They know no boundaries, and they are willing to cross any line to kind of have a conversation with a coach. And it's not necessarily always a bad thing. Sometimes they're just looking to have conversations about, or they're excited about a tournament. coach-athlete relationship constructs. So with coaches, they have these relationships with their athletes, and the strength of that relationship, your text argues, is built around these four constructs. So a coach, the success of that relationship is going to be related to closeness, commitment, complementary, and co-orientation. So closeness is kind of just that, this recognition that this relationship is going to be a long-term thing. Commitment really is significant in terms of the athlete buy-in, and this is both the athlete and the coach buy-in. We've all seen coaches who are kind of just paycheck coaches, especially at the high school level, but I'm sure you see it at the college level, where they just say, oh, I don't know, go scrimmage, or oh, just go watch this YouTube video, and provide little to no actual instruction. When there's a level of commitment on both the coach and the athlete level, the relationship seems to flourish. Complementary. This is when the athlete and the coach really start to complement each other in terms of understanding what each of them are looking for in their respective roles, right? So an athlete, for instance, after a big race, they can come up to, and I'm using track, after a big race, they can come up to a coach and say, oh, I was really focusing on the cues that you gave me, right? And an example would be an athlete videoing a race and then finally coming back to the coach with the video and saying, hey, this was my race, what can I do better, right? That's an example of an athlete and coach complementing each other nicely. And then lastly is co-orientation. Co-orientation is an interesting one in that, especially nowadays, we hear much more about the player's coach, right? The coach that kind of gets along with everyone. There's a time and place to get along with your athletes. However, we have to recognize that a coach does come from an authoritative role. There has to be some sort of superiority in that role, I think, for the relationship to be effective. Like a real world example I can give you guys right now is with the Brooklyn Nets. And when Steve Nash took over as the head coach for the Brooklyn Nets, right, there was a comment that stood out to me. And the comment was something along the lines of, we don't even need a coach. And I think and this was before they ever started, and right from the get-go, they were kind of destined to fail because, again, I'm not saying that a coach has to be this superior person, but there has to be a level of authority that the coach can act from in order for them to be effective. And that's kind of how we can view co-orientation. I think this is the last slide here. And this is leadership orientations. This is the multidimensional leadership theory. There's 5 aspects of this leadership theory, and this is autocratic behaviors, democratic behaviors, social support, positive feedback, training, and instruction. The most important aspect of this is that this is going to vary from person to person. It's going to vary from team to team, and it's going to vary based on situational characteristics. There's going to be a point in time when you need to be more autocratic. And what does autocratic mean? That means authoritative. There's going to be a point in time where you say, this is my team and you will listen to me. You are the athlete. And I think there is absolutely a point in time, and it depends on the type of athletes you have. There's also a point in time when you as a coach should have a more democratic role. So an example like this would be at the end of the season, when I'm making decisions for athletes for our state qualifier, I always ask my athletes what events they want to do. At that point in time, it's no longer about the team and it's no longer about me. It's about what the athletes individually want to qualify for at the state championships. That's just an example of a point in time, a situational characteristic where it should be a democratic decision, in my opinion. So social support. This And your assignment for the week. Read A Matter of Ethics, Coaches and the Kids. It talks about the show Friday Night Tykes, not Friday Night Lights. And just look at questions 1 and 2. With a lot of these things, you guys know there's not really anything you could really say to any extent that's terribly wrong. But after addressing questions 1 and 2, I'm going to link a short 2-minute video to Friday Night Tykes. And I want you guys to provide an example of 2 separate instances in the 2-minute video of really just negative coaching experiences or things that coaches clearly could have done better. Highlight them, and then what I want you to do is how could the coach done something differently? And really, it doesn't just have to be how the coach worded things in the game. Talk about other things, like in terms of just leadership qualities that they probably are not doing outside of practice or outside of the game, I should say, and things that maybe they could do better in practice, right? If you guys have any questions, let me know. That's pretty much it.